Everyone, I'm back with another film review, and this time it's It, now called Chapter 2, which I don't know if they're going to go back and call it Chapter 1, but anyway, we all get the idea. It's a sequel to arguably the most successful horror film ever, just in terms of gross dollars. So we're going to do our usual thing. Should you see it? And should you see it in the theaters or not? Then I'll talk a little bit about the film, and then we'll have spoilers. And the spoilers will contain a little bit more which aren't traditional spoilers, but looking at some of the controversial aspects of this film. So, should you see it or not? If you saw It Chapter 1, well, you kind of got to see it. You want to see what happened in the end. But what I will say is I don't think you need to go to the theater to see this. I think you probably know where it's all headed, and I don't think the film is big enough that you have to pay money to see it now. You could easily wait for DVD or for streaming or something like that. And then I'll explain why after the break. Okay, let's look at the film more from a technical point of view. So, the first thing is It Chapter 1, I loved it. I want to put that context out there because obviously by now you know I didn't love It Chapter 2. But I didn't hate it either. And this is why this film is quite weird. It falls within this little gap between a film which I kind of enjoyed, which technically has some real flaws but some real strengths, and then thematically has some big issues, which we'll talk about later. So, It Chapter 1 tracked these kids who live in Derry and who come up against this supernatural horror, Pennywise the Clown. It Chapter 2, 27 years later, those children have grown up into adults and are called back by Mike, who's the only person who stayed in Derry and who says, we've got to come back because it has come back. And they had made a pact at the end of Chapter 1 that if it ever came back, the monster, we would all come back. So, it is really clunky how this film tells you, and I don't think it's quite clear, is that anyone who's left Derry forgets. So, the other members of the Losers Club have forgotten really what happened in Derry and about it. The only person who's remembered is Mike. Mike calls them and they have these weird visceral reactions to the memory even though they can't remember. And then they come back, which kind of, why are they coming back? But anyway, because you'd get a phone call and they go, oh, hi, I'm Mike. You go, who are you? I wouldn't be traveling across the country. But anyway, they do come back and the memories start to reflow, and then the film starts. So the big thing, I guess, is the casting, which is real celebrity casting, because you had all these kids, everyone loved Chapter 1, and then instantly they said, wow, they should get X to play. And literally the film, the first one had been out like 7 hours, and everyone said, Jessica Chastain has to play Beverly, and that's what's happened. With the rest, it's been a little bit more hit and miss. James McAvoy plays Bill, and I actually think James McAvoy is really bad. And I like James McAvoy, he's a good actor, but I think he struggles with the accent a lot. He's not given a lot to do, so that makes it hard. I'm going to read out the others because I'll kind of forget them. Then you have Isaiah Mustafa, who you might know. He was that guy who was famously in the Old Spice ads, which were really, creative ads. And he's not bad. He plays Mike. Jay Ryan, who is a New Zealand guy, like a soap opera actor, very good looking. He plays Ben. James Ranson plays Eddie. And then you have Andy Bean as Stanley. And finally, you've got Bill Hader as Richie. Now, Bill Hader steals the whole film, which is good and bad in the sense that Bill Hader plays a comic who's struggling with anxiety in life. Now, if you know anything about Bill Hader, he is a comic who is publicly said he struggles with anxiety. So he's great, but, you know, if he wasn't great, there'd be a big problem. Jessica Chastain is very, very good. And the other person we haven't mentioned is, of course, Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, who is absolutely fantastic, but in a bit more limited scope this time. And that's a little bit because very early on we can see that it, or Pennywise, can take on other roles, which are kind of half new from chapter 1, but is using this way that he can just chameleon-like into other forms as a tactical way to get at all the members of the club. So, the film runs, I think, 2 hours and 49 minutes, give or take. Way too long for a horror film, but I don't mind long films. I enjoy long films if they've got something to say. The problem with this film is I don't think it knows what it wants to say. And one of the problems is it's trying to do psychological trauma as a means of entering into the horror, which means that it follows this very weird thing where it introduces everyone back, then they each are given a task to do, and they go do that, and it separates them. And then that's almost repeated again in the third act. And so really by the end, you're just going, come on, just get to it. We want to know more about it. So that's a major problem. The film is beautifully shot. There's a lot of CGI, and I don't think the CGI is that great. If you remember the first one, there were a lot of jump scares, but the jump scares all involve pretty much Pennywise and the kids. This time they're using other things, and they are not successful at all. I was not scared in this film whatsoever, apart from maybe 2 scenes involving Pennywise. And they were very classic and almost repeats from the first film. Let's get into spoilers. Okay, we're in spoilers, so I'm assuming you've seen It Chapter 2. And we've got a few things to talk about, some of them bigger than others. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about is there's a thing that we talk about whenever you're reviewing almost any creative work, but especially it seems to happen in films and TV series a bit more. And that is, what are the rules of your universe? And the reason why this is important is because we can all appreciate a fantasy world or a supernatural world in which we understand the rules. And so the rules might be that if you're out at night, and you fall asleep, then Freddy Krueger can get you. Okay, we understand that rule. Or it could be, that a certain creature can run after you, but if you throw water on it, it'll run away. You go, okay. Now we understand what the problems are that the characters have to get around. The problem is, in this film, it seems like Pennywise can literally just do anything. He can take any form at night or in the day, can act like another human, and it seems like he could literally just kill the losers at any point. Now, we know that he feeds on fear. That's why he often hunts for children, and because their fear is greater. And the thing which I don't think the film makes clear at all is there's 2 things going on in this town, which is the more fearful he makes people, they taste better when he eats them, which I don't think is ever made clear. But the other thing is that he is like a sickness within Derry, and that it is kind of poisoning everybody, and they're all becoming more feral over time, and that they're actually the real monsters, which works a little bit, I think is very clear in the first movie and is kind of muddy in the second. The other thing I really wanted to talk about is there's a little bit of a change, which is that Mike, who's the only guy, only one of the losers who stays in Derry and is a black man, in the book, he comes from really the only good family in the book. Everyone else is kind of, as in the film, a little bit off. but he comes from quite a middle-class family, and that gives him the ability to stay in the town, and he becomes the historian of it, which allows a lot of exposition. But in the film, they've made a change where his parents were crack addicts and die in a fire, and it doesn't affect the story, but it just seems a weird choice when you've got everyone else is so white, and you make the one black guy, who in the book is really middle class, make his parents crack addicts? Like, I don't know, that's an interesting choice. The other thing is, well, we'll talk about there's two more things. One is, by the end, we know, well, you know it pretty early on, but there's a counterpoint at the end where Stan, who has killed himself rather than face it, has sent these letters to all the people explaining why he did it. And his reason is, he says, I know, he kind of miles ahead of everyone else has worked out that they'll all have to go back to face it, and that if anyone is a weak link, it will, or Pennywise will use that against them, and they'll all be killed or lose. And Stan knows he can't handle it, so he's going to kill himself. And therefore, it'll only be the remaining people and they'll succeed. What that does is it makes his committing suicide is like a noble act, like a brave act, when really Stan knew none of that would be true. They could have just got there, and in the end, when you consider what is the ending, where they all just bully the bully till the bully dies, which is a very weak ending. Anyway, well, it's not clear that whether Stan was there or not would have made any difference, and so his suicide was not noble because he had no idea how it would happen. So I didn't like that at all. But let's get to the big issue, which is in the film, all of the members of the Losers go on these individual, in fact, they repeat it numerous times, at least twice, sometimes three, where they face their, to defeat Pennywise, they have to face their individual trauma. So Beverly, it's domestic violence. With Eddie, it's hypochondria, etc., etc. So it is very clear that trauma is the way that Pennywise will attack you. Okay, not a bad idea, and it kind of works in the first film quite well. The problem is that you have two very clear scenes, one right at the beginning and one right at the end, which is somehow linking the identification of being gay as possibly trauma. So the first scene is very different to nearly every other scene in the film, and that is the film opens and Andy Muschietti has chosen to shoot a hate crime against a gay couple, which is in the book, but the book was written in the 80s, a kind of different time, in which the teenagers have gone a bit feral, which is part of the thematic of the book, but they really go to town on this gay guy who stands up for himself, and it is shot not in a supernatural kind of way. They really just beat this man almost to death, throw him in the river, and then he gets eaten by it, which is weird because normally he only eats kids. I think the inference is he's come out of hibernation and will just eat anything and is starving, and that maybe these kids had to get someone so that he could eat after hibernation. So that is shot really horribly and is never mentioned again. So it'd be very different if that was like a big thing, like that's why they come together or whatever. I mean, loosely Mike sees it and then somehow sees it and therefore calls everyone, but it isn't thematically linked in. In fact, the only time you see that victim again is he's the one who hands a flyer to Richie, Bill Hader, and the implication is something to do with that why is Richie so anxious and all this. And we find out by the end of the film that the reason why Richie is a little bit anxious is because his secret is he's actually gay, and he's been in love either platonically because he couldn't accept it, or maybe even sexually in love with Eddie all his life. Now, this is a very dangerous thing to be saying, that everyone else who has been abused by other people or by incidents in their life, like Bill, who's lost his younger brother, that Eddie's trauma is being gay. Plus also the whole idea that he gets over it because he finally accepts that he was in love with Eddie. It's never said overtly, but it's there's a scene in which he scratches their initials, like as if they were teenage lovers, into a bit of wood. So I had a real problem with that, and I think Andy Muschietti, as the director, they just have not handled that at all. And when you consider it's such a long film, and it really felt like there was a lot of padding in some other scenes, that they've landed on that. Now, it's out of their argument would be, look, it's in the book and we want to reflect Stephen King. But there's plenty of other stuff which is in and out. The famous child orgy never made it. So I don't know why this had to make it, or why it couldn't have been changed slightly. I don't know, it bothered me. But again, this is the weird thing about this film. There was some major problems, but you still come out thinking it's just a solid horror film. It's just not a great film. It's not a film you would ever watch again. Really what I would love, I think, and you've got plenty of it, it's made so much money, surely someone would think of it, they should do, I think, the prequel of, because now we know it is basically this psychic spider who came on a meteor and has been haunting that area like a locust every 27 years. But you don't quite know this link to its main form, the clown. And I think that would be a great movie with Bill Skarsgård playing both roles, being the guy who runs the circus or works in the circus and has a family, and then is taken over and goes insane and becomes Pennywise. I think that would be a really interesting film. Okay, that's it for today. Look, if you like what I'm doing, hit like, subscribe. If you don't agree with what I'm saying, please, let's go into the comments below. I love to hear what people are thinking, whether they like this or they didn't like it. I'm on Twitter at Guru Eden, and let's have a chat there. So I'll see you soon. Bye.